Have you ever wondered what would happen if one day, without warning, your entire city went dark? Imagine, no electricity, no internet, no working traffic lights, and no way to charge your phone. Picture yourself sitting in your home as the sun sets, watching as the lights across your neighborhood slowly blink out, one by one. This isn't science fiction, it's a scenario that experts warn is becoming increasingly likely for millions of Americans. Today, we're diving into a frightening reality that's hiding in plain sight. America's aging and vulnerable power grid. It's a system that was built decades ago, long before the demands of our modern digital world, and long before the extreme weather patterns we now face. This crumbling infrastructure is being pushed to its limits, and in some cities it's already beginning to crack under the pressure. Did you know that power outages across the United States have increased by 78% in the past decade compared to the previous one? That's not just a random statistic, it's a warning sign. And for some major American cities, that warning is flashing red. So which communities are most at risk? Where might you find yourself suddenly plunged into darkness for days, or even weeks? And most importantly, what can you do to prepare if you live in one of these vulnerable areas? In this video, we're counting down the top 11 U.S. cities that experts say are facing potential catastrophic blackouts as their power grids reach breaking point. Some of these might surprise you, while others have already experienced frightening previews of what could be coming. Before we dive in, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss out on more crucial information that could affect your safety and well-being. Now let's get started with our countdown of the cities most at risk of total blackout. Number 11. Detroit, Michigan. When you think of America's most vulnerable power grids, Detroit might not be the first city that comes to mind. But this major Midwestern hub finds itself in an increasingly precarious position. Did you know that Michigan ranks second in the entire nation for major power outages since 2000? That's not a ranking any state wants to claim. What's behind Detroit's grid vulnerability? The answer lies in decades of neglect. According to recent investigations, inadequate tree trimming and a failure to replace aging equipment have left the city's power infrastructure extremely vulnerable to storms. And those storms are getting stronger and more frequent. Just last year, hundreds of thousands of Detroit area residents lost power multiple times due to high winds, storms, and flooding. One particularly devastating summer storm left over 500,000 homes and businesses without electricity for nearly a week in sweltering heat. But here's what makes Detroit's situation particularly concerning. The city's grid problems aren't just about weather. Years of economic challenges have meant less investment in critical infrastructure, creating a perfect storm of vulnerability. As climate change brings more extreme weather events to the region, experts warn that Detroit's residents could face not just occasional outages, but potentially catastrophic long-term blackouts that affect critical services. For Detroit residents watching this right now, have you noticed more frequent power outages in your neighborhood? The evidence suggests you're not imagining it, and the situation could get worse before it gets better. Number 10. Seattle, Washington. Our next city might surprise you. Seattle, known for its tech innovation and forward-thinking policies, is facing serious power grid vulnerability. Though for very different reasons than Detroit, the Seattle area's power grid faces a unique combination of threats. First, the heavily forested Pacific Northwest means that falling trees and branches during storms regularly damage power lines. But beyond that natural vulnerability, Seattle's grid has become a target for something more sinister: deliberate attacks. In a shocking incident just recently, 4 power substations in the region were deliberately sabotaged on a single day, leaving thousands without power during the holiday season. Federal investigators eventually arrested 2 men for the crime, but the incident exposed just how vulnerable these critical facilities are to physical attacks. But Seattle's problems don't end there. The region is also at high risk from another threat that many residents rarely think about: earthquakes. Seismologists have long warned about the Big U.S, a major earthquake that could devastate the Pacific Northwest. If such an event were to occur, Seattle's power grid would likely suffer catastrophic damage, potentially leaving the city in darkness for weeks or even months. Utilities like Puget Sound Energy are now taking steps to move power lines underground in some areas, which would protect them from both storms and physical attacks. But these efforts take time and money, and in the meantime, Seattle residents remain vulnerable to extended blackouts. If you're living in Seattle, ask yourself, do you have an emergency plan for when, not if, the next major power outage strikes? Number 9. Phoenix, Arizona. As we move to number 9 on our list, we shift from the rainy Pacific Northwest to the scorching desert Southwest. Phoenix, Arizona, faces a power grid threat that's quite different but equally dangerous: extreme heat. Phoenix is already one of the hottest major cities in America, regularly seeing summer temperatures soar well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But climate scientists warn that those already dangerous temperatures are only going to climb higher in the coming years, and that spells serious trouble for the power grid. Here's a frightening fact. A recent study found that if a multi-day heat wave and electrical grid failure occurred simultaneously in Phoenix, the city's residents would face a life-threatening emergency. Without air conditioning and temperatures that could reach 120 degrees or higher, homes would quickly become uninhabitable, and vulnerable populations like the elderly would be at serious risk. What makes Phoenix particularly vulnerable is a vicious cycle that occurs during extreme heat. As temperatures rise, demand for electricity skyrockets as air conditioners run constantly. At the same time, those high temperatures actually reduce the efficiency of power plants and transmission lines, meaning they produce less electricity precisely when demand is highest. Researchers at Georgia Tech have been studying this exact scenario in Phoenix as part of a three-city heat and electrical failure adaptation study. Their findings are sobering. Phoenix may face over 120 days annually with temperatures that can degrade transformer performance, leading to potential widespread failures. For Phoenix residents, the question isn't just theoretical. What would you do if your air conditioning suddenly stopped working during a 115-degree heat wave? And how long could you safely remain in your home? Number 8. Atlanta, Georgia. Moving to number 8 on our list, we find another major southern city facing its own unique set of power grid challenges. Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta's vulnerability stems from multiple factors converging at once. First, the city experiences frequent severe weather, from summer thunderstorms to winter ice events, both of which regularly damage power infrastructure. But Atlanta also faces growing demand from its rapidly expanding population and business sector, putting additional strain on an aging system. What many Atlanta residents don't realize is just how quickly things can go wrong. In 2017, the world got a sobering demonstration of this, when a small fire knocked out power to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the world's busiest airport at the time. The incident caused over 1,000 flight cancellations and created chaos that rippled through the global aviation system for days. As one energy expert commented after the airport blackout, 1. The grid is vulnerable. Secondly, it shows how dependent the modern economy is on reliable electric power. That incident affected just the airport. Imagine if a similar failure hit Atlanta's entire power grid. Adding to Atlanta's vulnerability is the increasing threat of cyber attacks targeting power infrastructure. Georgia Tech researchers are currently working on a Department of Energy-funded project to protect the grid from such attacks, recognizing that the threat is very real and growing. For those living in Atlanta, the key question is whether the city's power infrastructure can keep pace with both growing demand and increasingly severe weather events. The evidence suggests the answer might be no, at least in the short term. Number 7. Washington, D.C. At number 7, we find our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., a city where power outages could have implications far beyond inconvenienced residents. The district's power grid faces multiple serious challenges. A 2024 infrastructure report highlighted aging power lines that threaten grid stability throughout the capital region. Many of these transmission and distribution lines are decades old and increasingly prone to failure, especially during extreme weather events. But DC faces another unique challenge: the unprecedented growth of data centers in nearby Northern Virginia. These massive facilities consume enormous amounts of electricity, placing additional strain on the regional grid. In a frightening incident just last year, 60 data centers using 1,500 megawatts of power dropped off the grid simultaneously, nearly causing widespread power cuts throughout the region. Summer heat waves present another serious challenge for the capital. When temperatures soar, the grid is pushed to operate at or beyond its capacity, making it more vulnerable to cascading failures. Climate models predict that DC will face increasingly frequent and severe heat waves in the coming years, potentially pushing the aging grid beyond its breaking point. What makes Washington's vulnerability particularly concerning is that a major blackout wouldn't just affect residents. It could impact government operations and national security. While critical facilities like the White House and Pentagon have backup generators, many important government functions lack such redundancy. For DC residents, the question is stark: is the capital's power grid receiving the investment and attention it deserves, given its national importance? Many experts say it is not. Number 6. Chicago, Illinois. As we reach the midpoint of our countdown, we arrive at the Windy City, Chicago's power grid vulnerabilities represent a perfect storm of aging infrastructure, severe weather, and emerging threats. Chicago's electrical grid, much like many major U.S. cities, relies on infrastructure that's decades old in many places. But what makes Chicago's situation particularly concerning is how the city experiences weather extremes at both ends of the spectrum, from blistering summer heat waves to Arctic winter cold snaps. During summer heat waves, electricity demand skyrockets as millions of air conditioners run simultaneously. Meanwhile, winter brings its own challenges, as the extreme cold that sometimes grips the Midwest can damage equipment and cause failure. This combination means Chicago's grid rarely gets a break from environmental stress. But beyond weather, Chicago faces another growing threat: cyber attacks, targeting critical infrastructure. The U.S. Energy Department has identified over 15,000 new cyber vulnerabilities in the national electrical grid, and major urban centers like Chicago are prime targets. Security experts warn that a sophisticated cyber attack could potentially shut down power to large portions of the city for extended periods. What might such an attack look like? In 2015, hackers successfully attacked Ukraine's power grid, leaving over 230,000 people in the cold and dark. U.S. intelligence officials warn that similar attacks against American cities are not just possible but increasingly likely. For Chicago residents, this raises a troubling question. Is your household prepared for an extended power outage, potentially during the most extreme weather conditions the city experiences? If not, now might be the time to start planning. Number 5. Miami, Florida. Halfway through our countdown, we arrive at Miami, a city facing perhaps the most visible and inevitable threat to its power grid: hurricanes. Miami's vulnerability to hurricanes is nothing new, but climate scientists warn that the threat is intensifying. As ocean temperatures rise, hurricanes are becoming both more frequent and more powerful, and Miami's power infrastructure, despite improvements, remains highly vulnerable to these storms. A recent study specifically examining South Florida's power grid found it increasingly vulnerable to both sea level rise and hurricane damage. The combination creates a particularly dangerous scenario: storm surge flooding electrical substations and distribution equipment, potentially causing catastrophic and long-lasting outages. What makes Miami's situation particularly concerning is the cascading effects that would follow a major grid failure. Without power, water treatment facilities can't operate properly. In the intense heat and humidity of South Florida, buildings quickly become uninhabitable without air conditioning. And in a region where many residents are elderly, these conditions can quickly become life-threatening. Another troubling finding: research has revealed socioeconomic disparities in hurricane-induced power outages in Florida. Lower-income communities often experience longer outages and slower restoration times, meaning some of Miami's most vulnerable residents face the greatest risk. For Miami residents, the question isn't if a major hurricane will strike but when, and whether the power grid will be able to withstand the impact or recover quickly. Recent evidence suggests the answer is concerning. Number 4. New Orleans, Louisiana. At number 4 on our list, we find another Gulf Coast city with painful experience of what happens when a power grid fails catastrophically: New Orleans. The memory of Hurricane Katrina's devastation in 2005 remains vivid for many, but more recent events have shown that New Orleans's power grid remains highly vulnerable despite lessons supposedly learned. When Hurricane Ida struck in 2021, it completely disabled the city's power grid, leaving the entire city in darkness for days, with some areas without power for weeks. What's particularly troubling about New Orleans' situation is that investigations following Ida revealed the power company Entergy had repeatedly resisted meaningful upgrades to the system. Even more concerning, a $210 million natural gas power plant that was specifically built to power the city during emergencies failed to come to the rescue when 8 transmission lines were disabled by the storm. The vulnerabilities in New Orleans run deep: aging infrastructure, inadequate investment in resilience, and a location that puts it directly in the path of increasingly powerful hurricanes. Climate scientists warn that the Gulf Coast will likely see more frequent and more intense storms in the coming years, putting additional strain on an already fragile system. For New Orleans residents, the question is whether enough is being done to prevent the next major outage. A 2021 NPR investigation found that Entergy collected tens of millions of dollars from customers specifically for grid improvements that were never adequately made. The result: residents paid the price both financially and through extended suffering during blackouts. Number 3. Los Angeles, California. As we enter the top 3 cities on our countdown, We arrive at Los Angeles, America's second largest city and one facing multiple serious threats to its power grid. Los Angeles faces a unique combination of grid vulnerabilities. First, the region is experiencing increasingly extreme heat waves, with temperatures regularly climbing above 100 degrees. UCLA researchers studying the impact of climate change on Southern California's power grid have found that these heat events will become both more frequent and more severe, putting enormous strain on the system. But heat isn't LA's only problem. The region also faces the constant threat of wildfires, which have directly impacted power infrastructure in recent years. During high wind events, utilities have implemented public safety power shutoffs, deliberately cutting electricity to prevent power lines from sparking fires. These planned outages have sometimes affected hundreds of thousands of residents at once. And that's not all. Los Angeles also sits in earthquake country. Seismologists warn that a major quake along the San Andreas Fault could sever critical power transmission lines, potentially leaving parts of the city without electricity for weeks. What makes LA's situation particularly concerning is a 2023 finding from UCLA researchers that estimated the vulnerability of Los Angeles's electricity infrastructure to rising air temperatures could result in a 20% loss of rated component capacity by 2060. In simple terms, the grid will become less effective precisely when it needs to be at its most reliable. For Los Angeles residents, the question becomes not just about inconvenience, but survival. In a city designed around air conditioning and where water must be pumped to reach many homes, how would you cope during an extended blackout? Number 2. Texas power grid, Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. At number 2 on our list, we have a special entry. Not just one city, but the major urban centers of Texas that share a common, highly vulnerable power grid. Texas operates its own isolated power grid, separate from the rest of the country, a fact that many Texans learned the hard way during Winter Storm Uri in February 2021. When that unprecedented storm hit, the grid collapsed catastrophically, leaving more than 4.5 million homes and businesses without power, some for days in freezing temperatures. The human toll was devastating. At least 2,046 people died, and property damage exceeded $195 billion. What's particularly alarming is that despite billions spent on improvements since that disaster, energy experts warn that the Texas grid remains highly vulnerable. In 2024, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, projected an 80% likelihood of rolling blackouts if a storm of similar magnitude were to hit the state again. The fundamental problems with the Texas grid are manifold. Isolation from other regional grids, which prevents importing power during emergencies, inadequate weatherization of critical infrastructure, and a market design that critics say prioritizes profit over reliability. Major Texas cities like Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio face the highest risk, with their dense populations and critical infrastructure. During Uri, Houston, America's fourth largest city, saw widespread water system failures as treatment plants lost power and pipes burst in the cold. For Texans, the question is blunt. Do you trust that enough has been done to prevent another catastrophic failure? Recent assessments suggest skepticism is warranted, with the grid operator itself acknowledging significant remaining vulnerabilities. Number 1. New York City, New York. We've finally reached the top of our countdown, the U.S. city that experts identify as facing the highest risk of a catastrophic grid failure. New York City, America's largest city, relies on an electrical grid that in many places dates back to the early 20th century. In fact, some parts of Manhattan's grid were designed by Thomas Edison himself. This aging infrastructure struggles to meet the growing demands of a modern metropolis, especially during heat waves when air conditioning usage soars. What makes New York's situation particularly alarming is a recent assessment from the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO, which identified a projected 446 megawatt deficiency in the city's power resources. Put simply, the city is on track to need more electricity than it can reliably supply. The consequences of a major blackout in New York would be devastating. During the 2003 Northeast blackout, which affected the city for less than 24 hours, thousands were trapped in subways and elevators. Hospitals relied on emergency generators, and the economic impact ran into billions of dollars. A longer outage would be catastrophic, especially during a heat wave when the city's dense urban environment creates a dangerous heat island effect. Climate change is exacerbating these risks. A Columbia University study found that certain New York City areas, including eastern Queens, Upper Manhattan, and the Bronx, are particularly vulnerable to weather-related outages. These areas also tend to have higher concentrations of elderly and low-income residents who may lack resources to cope with extended blackouts. For New Yorkers, the question is existential: is the city doing enough to prepare for what energy analysts increasingly see as an inevitable major grid failure? Current evidence suggests the answer is no. So what can you do if you live in one of these vulnerable cities? First, don't panic, but do prepare. Create an emergency kit with essentials like flashlights, batteries, non-perishable food, and water. Consider investing in a small generator or power station that can at least keep essential devices charged and small appliances running. Second, stay informed. Know how to get emergency information when normal communication channels might be down. A battery-powered or hand-crank radio can be invaluable during extended outages. Third, have a plan for vulnerable family members, especially the elderly or those with medical needs that require electricity. Identify community resources or backup options before an emergency happens. Finally, consider supporting initiatives to modernize and strengthen the power grid in your community. This might mean accepting temporary rate increases to fund critical infrastructure improvements, an investment that could pay off tremendously during the next major weather event. America's power grid vulnerabilities represent a slow-moving crisis that's only beginning to get the attention it deserves. The cities we've discussed today face real and growing risks that demand serious action from policymakers, utilities, and individual citizens alike. If you found this information valuable, please hit that like button and share this video with friends and family, especially those living in high-risk areas. Subscribe to our channel for more crucial information on preparing for emergencies and understanding the challenges facing our communities. Remember, knowledge and preparation are your best defense against the growing threat of power grid failures. Stay safe, stay informed, and thanks for watching.